Our next presentation, I can imagine, will be absolutely delicious, or might take on some flavor of its own, because we should expect nothing less from Dan Kittredge, the founder of the Bionutrient Food Association. Dan grew up around leaders in the organic farming movement and himself was a farmer for over 30 years. And in this process, he thought to himself, wonder how much healthier and happier we could be if the density of nutrients in our food was richer. And along with the Bionutrient Food Association, Dan is involved with the Real Food campaign, out of which he's developing a handheld spectrometer that can allow us to test the nutrient density of our food, which of course can allow the consumer to go and pick up a carrot and test the amount of macro and micronutrients within that, which is an advocacy for soil health, because of course we know that it is the microbes that allow plants to have access to not just the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but also to the calcium, magnesium, boron, and all of those micronutrients that plants need in order to make the cofactors and the enzymes inside of their photosynthetic machinery, or to be able to allow their membranes to have just the right fluidity to be rigid but supple to intake the right nutrients at the right time. And of course, when we eat these foods, it allows us to be able to regenerate bones and be sensitive to the shifts in hormonal balances within our bodies. And without a complete set of the micronutrients, we can't function as healthy, both physically and mentally, as we can. And so I'm very grateful for Dan's work, that he's out there helping to promote not only human health through the Bionutrient Food Association, but advocating for soil health in this way. Because the more we learn about humans and soil, it seems that health begets health, and that's just a beautiful cycle. So, with that, it is my honor to introduce Dan Kittredge.
This is Dan Kittredge from the Bionutrient Food Association, here to talk about principles of biological systems today. Our educational work from the BFA has been largely guided by these foundational principles, primarily working with growers, helping them to understand what it was that plants evolved with the capacity to do, and supporting them in that process. A lot of the way that farming is done these days, regardless of the scale, really does not take into consideration those deeper insights. And so that's really my objective today in discussing what are those principles and how to apply them. So I like to start with the basic understanding that plants are green, and that they're green because they cover their bodies in chloroplasts, which are full of chlorophyll, in which occurs this magic operation called photosynthesis, whereby carbon dioxide and water and sunlight are converted into sugar and oxygen. People have heard about this. They know about the oxygen going into the atmosphere for us to breathe. And now they're more and more aware of the fact that in nature, plants use a lot of the sugar they make in their leaves to feed the microbiology, their gut flora, I like to call it, whether it's within their bodies or on their leaves or around their roots. This broader ecosystem of microbes, which is the bottom of the food chain, which is how plants evolve to eat, is evolved to engage in deep symbiosis with plants. And so the foundational point I like to make is that regardless of what kind of plant you're working with, be it a perennial pasture or a orchard tree, or annual vegetables, roots, medicinal plants, it doesn't matter what type of plant you're working with. This foundational understanding and principles apply. Plants evolve to eat through symbiotic relationship with microbes. They did not evolve to eat fertilizer. So depending on where your soil type is, what your climate zone is, what your temperature, elevation, et cetera, there may be different issues that you as a grower struggle with foundationally that keep life from flourishing. And so today's presentation will cover 5 basic dynamics to be working to maintain from the microbial perspective. They themselves, of course, need to be there. And oftentimes that is the least least effort causing, the least expensive, the biggest bang for your buck piece you can do is ensure that broad spectrum of microbes are present in the environment. But beyond that, those microbes, once they are present, need air to breathe, they need water to drink, they need food to eat, and they need some basic minerals to build their bodies out of. Of course, warmth is also a key factor, which is why we don't plant our gardens in the fall unless we're living close to the equator. But air, water, food, and some basic minerals to build your body out of. So let's just cover those 5 pieces and talk about some simple ways that can be used to address them, to maintain them, to ensure their presence. My experience as a farmer, I didn't say this, but I grew up on an organic farm and have been farming all my life, is that when these dynamics are present, then much less effort is necessary. If you think about how indigenous cultures globally were working with the land to, increase vitality, ensure sufficiency and excess of foodstuffs. They didn't use a lot of tillage or metal or fertilizer. They worked much more thoughtfully and sensitively with nature. So my experience as a farmer is that when you are able to do that, your level of effort goes down, the level of yield and economic viability and quality of life go up. So inoculation is the first piece. I said ensuring the full spectrum of microbes are present. We want to think about it from the perspective of, we'll say we're doing an annual crop as an example, a lettuce or a cucumber or tomato. When that plant germinates, if you were to think of an analog, it would be when an animal is born. We generally understand that when a human baby is born, there are no microbes in its alimentary canal. It doesn't have any gut flora, and colostrum is evolved to establish that gut flora so that then the baby can digest its food, because it's not the animal that does so much of the digestion in you, it's the microbes that do the digestion in you. And so as we need colostrum for our children and our cows, etc., at birth, we also need colostrum for our plants at birth. So ensuring a nice spectrum of microbes are present on the coat of the seed at germination, at planting, is a extremely powerful technique. Extremely inexpensive and really profound in its capacity for revitalizing soils globally and bringing greater vitality to plants. So there's a number of different techniques. You can certainly buy mixed inoculants. I generally suggest that you look for a material that's got a very broad spectrum of species. Different families of plants, of course, have different families of microbes that they work well with. And so you can tune your microbe mix to a plant, but that's oftentimes very difficult. And we don't actually know all the answers of which families are all appropriate to have in a family of plants. So I would say erring on the side of a broad spectrum is strategic. People have used indigenous microorganisms, IMOs. They have made ferments of their own. There's compost teas, there's worm castings, there's worm juice. There's any number of materials that can be used to ensure this broad spectrum of microbes are present at germination. But unless you know that the mother plant had a good, healthy microbiome, and that seed was saved in a way that ensured that that core microbiome is present, I'd say this is one of the most powerful things you can do, is inoculate your seed. So liquid or powder, store-bought, homemade, I don't particularly care. What I care about is that that broad spectrum is present. So people can look up for themselves where and how to do that. I just want to make the point that it's a critical piece of the puzzle. And thereafter, of course, inoculants can be applied to the soil or to the leaf surface. Different species, of course, living in different parts of the plant, to good benefit when it looks like the plant may be struggling later in its life cycle, potentially. So that would be the life piece of the quotient, quite easy to address, oftentimes very inexpensive. And I like to say when I give presentations, if there's one thing you take from this, simplest, easiest, least expensive thing to do, let it be establish good microbial symbiosis with your plants. Air is a really important piece of the puzzle. I like to say when you reach out into the soil with your hand, how far can you reach down before it starts to get stuck underneath your fingernails? Is it a half inch or 2 inches or 6 inches, or can you really work your way down up to your elbow, because that soil has great structure. If you understand that most of the symbiotic microbes are aerobic, which means they like to breathe air, then if you have a soil environment 2 inches below the surface or 4 inches below the surface, which is very tight, then you should expect that below that point, microbes should not be expected to flourish. So this is why oftentimes farmers will till the ground in the spring, is because the soil has not been well cared for over the winter, and it's oftentimes tight. It's more like dirt than soil. And so they understand that to get a plant to grow well, it must have that sort of more loose environment, and not loose as in totally friable, but at least with good structure. So how do you maintain that aerobic zone in the soil, deep down into the subsoil? Certainly there are things like tillage, deep rippers, there's the yeoman's plow. There are mechanical techniques that can be used to facilitate that aeration. But ideally, when we look into nature, we don't see that occurring. Nature is able to maintain an aerobic zone without that kind of mechanical engagement. So how does nature do it? In my understanding, one of the most powerful things that is done to maintain that aeration is to keep it alive. If you go into the winter in the forest, you won't see bare soil. You'll see leaves and other plant material laying on the surface, but you will not see bare soil enough to scratch down quite a bit to get there. When you don't have green leaves making sugar, feeding soil life in some number of months of the year, depending on where you live, ensuring that you are able to maintain that aeration, maintain that plant, those microbes being fed, is critical. And so it's the dead plant material which basically serves as the reserve food for microbes, and you want to ensure a healthy quantity of that. So that means if you're a farmer, not living in, not growing your crops underneath oak boughs, that you want to make sure there's plant material on the surface of the land going into the winter. Cover crops are great. Ideally, you want to have a few different species of plants, families of plants growing in an area at least part of the year, because each plant has its own gut flora, and the more different families of plants like legumes and brassicas and grasses, they all have different gut floras. So if you're going to be putting a forage radish and a clover and a wheat or an oat, doesn't really matter, down as a cover crop, those different families of plants will ensure a broader spectrum of species. But what's important also is that they are, through their building of their bodies, when the snow comes and lays them down, then they can be eaten by the soil life. Mulch is also great. Ideally, you have things living if possible, but certainly cover with brown material is superior to bare soil. My experience as a farmer has been that if I go out in March or April to check the garlic, maybe just coming up, if I reach under the mulch where the garlic is growing, I'll find a nice layer of worm castings, and I'll be able to reach my hand into the soil. But directly adjacent to that, an area that may have been bare during the winter, bare soil, it'll oftentimes be much more tight and hard. And so we have areas that are directly adjacent to each other that have very different aeration. And I think that's primarily because of whether the microbes are able to be fed during the winter. So there we have inoculation, establishing the spectrum of microbes. We have aeration, a critical component of the puzzle, and feeding, also a critical component of the puzzle. Think about when during the growing season you can see how much soil. You may be putting your baby seedlings of kale or tomatoes in the ground in May or in April, depending on where you are, and oftentimes people will do that, and then they will have significant amounts of bare soil between those plants. On my farm, I like to, as soon as I'm putting anything in like that, it's going to be fairly far apart, I'll lay down significant levels of mulch to keep that soil covered. I'm operating on a 1 to 2 acre scale, but if operating on a dozens or hundreds or thousands of acres scale, this can be fairly readily done with winter killing cover crops or strategic like the knocking down the rye when it's in its milk stage. You can take plants that are green and alive, and at the right point in time, you can cause them to no longer be alive without killing them with chemicals. But really maintaining that soil cover through the entire growing season. Through the winter is great, but oftentimes there's a significant period of time there in the spring as well when you don't have bare soil, when you do have bare soil. So perhaps mulching in the spring at planting, and then as that mulch is eaten by the soil life into the growing season, maybe in July or August, when it's starting to be not much left, then you could undersow your cover crops. Again, a spectrum of species if possible. Think about a tomato plant or a pepper or an eggplant in July or August. It's probably got a few feet to it, and so you can undersow those cover crops at that point in time, and then once the tomato plant or pepper plant is killed by the frost in September or October, those cover crops will be a good 2 or 3 feet and coming up strong. So you don't need to take plants out, put new ones in, bring in all kinds of machinery to engage this process. But keeping the soil alive, keeping it fed, keeping it covered, these are really, really important pieces of the puzzle for maintaining a good microbial activity. All right, so the next topic would be hydration, maintaining good hydration. I oftentimes see on farms or even in gardens that people, depending on the dynamic, they may or may not actually have an irrigation system. With the climatic irregularities that we're beginning to experience more and more here in New England, not every year, but many years we do have a 4, 6, 8 week period with very, very little rain. And so those who don't have the ability to maintain moisture in the soil should expect that the soil life will shut down, stop feeding the plants, and that will actually be a very directly causal factor in pest pressure, disease pressure, limited yield, things like that. So I don't, again, particularly care about what the form of maintaining hydration is. Irrigation, you have drip tape, you've got, overhead, there's, as many different techniques as there are scales and infrastructures. Those are all fine. Ensuring the capacity is the key point here. I think if you look into nature, we don't see drip tape. We don't see that kind of a system in place. So again, we can ask the question: how does nature maintain hydration in a drought? Why is it that the grasses in the pasture are able to grow much longer than the crops in the field when it hasn't rained? And so there's a couple points here. One is that the more perennial of the ecosystem, the deeper the roots, the greater the plant's ability to access soil water. So if you've got an area that's been tilled and you've got a plow pan, as in 6 inches down, the soil is very, very tight. Access to that subsoil water is going to be difficult. The plants are only going to be able to get what's coming down from above or in that top 6 inches. So ensuring that you have good structure in your soil. Again, there are techniques for cracking open plow pans, using deep-rooted cover crops. On my farm, when I see a dandelion growing, or anything with that sort of a deep taproot structure, I understand that to be nature's cover crop. She thinks that that plant needs to be growing there to facilitate her system functioning more well. So if I've got kale plants that are 2 feet tall, am I bothered by dandelions growing underneath them? No, I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about that. So perhaps we need to be considering our visions of what a pretty garden looks like, or a pretty field or appropriate field looks like. I don't think it's a monoculture. I think if plants are not directly competing with your crops and nature's planted them, I would err on the side of keeping them as much as possible. So nature doesn't do monocultures. You don't see, all red oaks growing in the forest. You see a mix of different types of plants growing. But the other key point I want to make about water, there's a couple. One is from the permaculture perspective, we understand that depending on the lay of your land, ideally stockpiling water in the form of ponds and that kind of a water source is very valuable. It will effectively, especially the higher on the landscape the pond is, it will keep the water table high through gravity slowly over time. So working with the lay of your land, if you've got a wet spot somewhere higher, consider digging that out. Sort of working to build stockpiles of water on the landscape, I think, is not only strategic for maintaining hydration for crops, but also very beneficial for the broader ecosystem, birds, animals, insects. At the edge of water is where the greatest vitality is. So thinking about pollinators and all that kind of stuff, the more of those pieces you have in your landscape, the better. The other piece I like to talk about is what we call a tidal force. People are familiar with the concept. If you go to the edge of the ocean, to the beach, and you stand in the same spot for long enough, the water will come up and then go back down again a couple times a day. You've got a high tide and a low tide that's associated with the gravity of the moon. My understanding is that the tidal force applies not only to the ocean, but to all water on planet Earth. And my understanding is that your water table may be 4 feet down at 2 a.m., but it may be only 10 inches down from the surface at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The tidal force will literally pull water up through capillary action and gravity from the subsoil to the topsoil if you've got good soil structure. So maintaining a good water table through stockpiling water in the land in the form of ponds where it's naturally low and wet, and then ensuring good soil structure should facilitate much greater drought resilience in the form of natural water from the landscape. So that's a key piece of this broader puzzle, I think, is continuing to look at how nature does it, where we're not quote unquote farming. What are the actual vectors that are causing life to be able to do well with no fertilizer, with no irrigation, with no tillage, etc., with no pest and disease killing techniques. So, okay, we've covered the first four, the microbes, ensuring their presence, air, food, water. The final piece I like to talk about, and one that I don't hear a lot of people focusing on, so I think I might spend a couple of more minutes on it, is the minerals. There's a broad spectrum of minerals that are needed in biological systems to function. There's these compounds called enzymes, which are used, I think of them as sort of like sockets and wrenches. If you're fixing your car, taking off your tire, changing the muffler, there's sockets and wrenches, things that have specific shapes and sizes that are used to take things apart and put them back together again. That's basically what enzymes do in living systems. So building a cell, building an eyeball, building protein, digesting protein, digesting carbohydrates, all of these living system processes require enzymes to occur. It's like the toolkit of nature. And at the center of every enzyme is a different element. There's copper-based enzymes and cobalt-based enzymes and chromium-based enzymes, etc. And in some situations, those elements are at insufficient levels or are unavailable for microbial activity. And so literally what happens is the microbes can't live there. I will use an example, vitamin B12. People may have heard about vitamin B12. Sometimes people who are vegans or vegetarians are told to supplement their diet with a B12 because it's not present in sufficiently high enough levels in their plant-based diet. B12 is a compound in science called cobalamin, and at the center of it is one atom of cobalt, cobalamin, cobalt. If we as humans don't have enough B12 in our bodies, we become dead. We are B12 dependent organisms. We need, about the amount that would fit on the head of a pin. But if we don't have it, we're dead. And so you can say we're cobalt dependent organisms. We need a certain amount of cobalt in our body to exist, or otherwise we can't exist. And so, there's many elements like that. Some people have heard about copper and zinc and boron and sulfur. Some like yttrium and molybdenum and vanadium that people may not have heard about, at least since high school science class. Ensuring that full spectrum of elements are present in relationship to the microbes is foundational, because they have the same exact enzyme systems and they need them to function for them to live. So if it's all about the microbes flourishing, ensuring a full spectrum of minerals, at least that are necessary for life, are present in the environment is crucial. And based on historical dynamics, whether it's, agriculture has been practiced in this area in a fairly destructive fashion for the past 300 years, and a lot of leaching has occurred. The topsoil that was there has leached away. Here in New England, we can safely say that elements like boron and sulfur and molybdenum, which are anions, which means they're likely to leach when it rains, are not present in the top 6 inches of the soil, and not present necessarily in sufficient levels for life to flourish. They may be present 2 feet down or 6 feet down or 12 feet down where they leached to, but if our annual crops don't have the capacity to reach down and pull them up, then that will be a limiting factor in the growth of our plants. And this was when I started looking, beyond just the organic sort of rubric into more biological ag, attending the Acres conferences and learning a lot of the wisdom from that network 15 years ago. It was experimenting with rock dust and remineralization, I think along with inoculation, but the remineralization was quite profound in its effect in the overall function of the soil and our crops. So it doesn't need to be anything fancy. My initial experimentations were with finely ground granite from a local quarry. I find that basalts generally are better, the basalt type of rocks, as a material. I think sea salt is also a really wonderful material. These are naturally occurring. The continents are made out of rocks and the oceans are made out of seawater. So it's not like I'm recommending anything from off-site that would be necessarily highly extractive or limited. But, if you look sort of maybe in the Amazon, in an area that has not been glaciated for millions of years, those soils, a lot of the soils around the equatorial regions of the planet are what's called laterite soils, which means they're very old. They've been weathered. A lot of the nutrients, the minerals that were foundationally there from the parent rock have been leached out. That's part of why in the Amazon, when they cut down the trees and they grow their soy for 2 years, they don't grow up for more than 2 years. They move on, because literally all the soy ate was the minerals that were in the plants. And then once that's been used up, there's nothing left in the soil. So they move on, they cut down more trees. So again, depending on where you're at in the planet, what your parent soil types are, what your geological history is. In many cases, I find that there are mineral deficiencies, and understanding them and addressing them systemically, I think, is another key piece of this broader puzzle. You don't necessarily need to add minerals on an annual basis. If you're strategic about it, you can do it once and not have to do anything else for 20 or 40 years. And I would suggest the process may be taking a top 6 inches soil test, sort of the classic agronomic soil test, to see roughly what's there, and then maybe like a geological soil core, going down 3 feet and seeing what's in that reasonable area that roots could access, and see if there are things that are not present in the top 6 inches that are present in the top 3 feet. Then we can think about strategies for using cover crops to pull those up, bioaccumulator plants, etc. But yeah, those are I think really important pieces of the puzzle. When it comes to, I'll give another example. Molybdenum is another key element. Those who have used bean and pea inoculant, generally on the label they'll say it contains the Azotobacter or Rhizobacter species of microbes. They won't often tell you that also included in that packet is some sodium molybdate, molybdenum. Because the molybdenum is the center of the nitrogenase enzyme, and the nitrogenase enzyme is the tool that the microbes use to pull the nitrogen out of the atmosphere and convert it into a form the plants can access. So molybdenum, as I said, is an anion. It tends to leach. We need about 2 pounds of molybdenum in an acre of soil for all the nitrogen that needs to be accessed by our crop plants to be accessed from the atmosphere. And if you don't have that molybdenum, then you're going to need to add nitrogen. You're going to need to add, fertilizer, urea, compost, liquid fish. There's all kinds of things that people add. They feel like they need to add nitrogen. You look into the forest, no one's adding nitrogen. No one's putting down fertilizer in the forest. It's because all those plants, even though they're not legumes, have the ability to do that only when the necessary microbes are present and when the necessary minerals are present. You need them both for this process to occur. So there's a couple, I think, good examples there. I've covered the broader 5 topics I like to cover, and I'll just do a couple more points at the end here about the Bionutrient Food Association and our work as it pertains to nutrient density and food quality. That is our foundational objective, is to increase quality in the food supply. And by quality, we're talking about flavor, aroma, nutritive value, health-giving attribute. We understand that there are some quite profound variations in nutrient levels in food. This carrot to that carrot, this cucumber to that cucumber. And they have everything to do with how that food was produced. So, you can take the same variety of carrot, a bolero carrot, and plant it in 4 different soils and engage it in 4 different fertility programs, and you will get, quite different nutrient levels in those 4 carrots. It's not about, boleros grow this and nantes grow that as far as nutrient levels. Certainly genetics are part of it, but the microbiome, the whole function of the ecosystem really is what goes into the variation of nutrient levels in crops. So at the BFA, we have been working with a number of partners across North America and now Europe as well to document the nutrient variation in food. We've got 3 labs now, one in California, our main lab in Michigan, and our 3rd lab in France. We've taken samples from now over 150 farms, from growers producing 20 different crops. We've asked them to document their soil type, their fertility program, their management practices, their cultivars, etc. So document how they produce the crop with the filling out a little form, and then when they harvest the crop, to send us that crop as well as the soil it grew in, so the top 4 inches and the next 4 inches. And then we've been looking at the nutrient variations in the food as it correlates to the dynamics in the soil, the microbiology, and the mineral levels, and the organic matter, as well as the management practices. So we can begin to tease out, of all the recommendations that are given by this product, use this technique, this tool's better, this cover crop mix. There's a lot of information out there for growers about this is the best thing, or this is, do that here. We don't really have a matrix where we begin to tease out, actually in this area, these are the limiting factors. And over there, it's the entirely different set of dynamics that need to be addressed. But our metric is the nutritional value of the food. And we found, if you're looking at the elements, things like copper and zinc and iron and potassium, that the variation from this carrot to that carrot may be 3-to-1. This carrot has 3 times as much calcium in it as that carrot or copper. And, iron maybe in spinach, this leaf of spinach has 18 times as much iron in it as that leaf of spinach. We do understand that there are some pretty significant nutritional deficiencies that are, of significant interest, concern, not just in the developing world, but in the developed world as well. The Sustainable Development Goals of the UN identify this as a key issue. Things like zinc, a third of the world's population are deficient in zinc. Well, if you're eating 1 carrot or 100 grams of rice, and this one over here has 6 times as much zinc in it as that, it doesn't take long to actually systemically address these underlying nutritional deficiencies in humans through choosing the food, not changing the food they're eating, but choosing the food that is more nutritious. And so that has been our broader objective, is to help people understand the nutritional value of the food they're eating or producing, and make choices about that. I have here the first generation of our little spectrometer. It's actually a colorimeter. It only looks at 10 frequencies. And basically this is calibrated now to 6 crops. The first 6 crops we did in 2019, carrots and spinach and lettuce and tomatoes and grapes and kale. And we'll be rapidly adding to that. But we now have the ability to take this and put it up against the carrot. Press the button on your smartphone, it flashes the light of the carrot, it reads what's in it or not in it, and spits out an answer on your smartphone, which says, top quartile, bottom quartile, middle 50%, red, yellow, green, or that would be green, red, yellow. But, to begin to provide some empirical transparency into the nutritional value of food that the farmer can have access to when they're selling it, that the buyer can have access to, that the consumer can have access to. And then correlating that with management practices that support life, because we understand it's when the microbes at the bottom of the food chain are flourishing that the actual crops are providing the nutrition that we're looking for in our bodies. The more we can openly share, connect, and empower people to make decisions around this, the more rapidly we think we'll be able to not only address some of the quite existential climate issues that we're facing right now, but also some of those existential health issues. Really, all these things do seem to be very intimately connected. And so hopefully this has been a illustrative presentation on some of these topics. Thank you very much.